What if the most lifeless place on Earth could breathe again? What if a land of sand and silence could cradle an ocean of life? Somewhere in the far reaches of northwestern China, that question has already been answered. In the heart of the Taklamakan Desert, once known as the Sea of Death, life has returned in the unlikeliest form imaginable. For centuries this desert devoured everything that entered it. Winds screamed across 300,000 square kilometers of emptiness, carving dunes higher than buildings. Travelers wrote of horizons that never changed, of air so dry it seemed to steal the breath from their lungs. Here, rain was a myth and shade a memory. Nothing should have survived. And yet, beneath the surface, something ancient was waiting. Hidden under the dunes lay rivers born from distant glaciers, channels of saline groundwater ignored for generations. The locals called it dead water, too salty, too alkaline, too cruel for crops or cattle. But to a handful of scientists, that dead water looked less like failure and more like a blank canvas. If the chemistry could be balanced, if the minerals could be tuned to mimic the sea, perhaps the desert could be taught to live again. They began quietly. A few ponds carved into the sand, tanks flown in from coastal hatcheries, a handful of fish released into water that tasted like the memory of an ocean. The world barely noticed. Even the researchers doubted what they were seeing. Days passed, then weeks. Sensors blinked, winds howled, and still the fish swam. Against every law of logic, they thrived. News traveled slowly, at first as rumors, seafood in the desert, crabs under the dunes. But what sounded like madness became measurable fact. Oxygen levels rose. Growth rates soared. The water, once toxic, had found balance. The desert had begun to whisper a new story, one not of death, but of creation. It wasn't a miracle. It was patience, chemistry, and an unshakable belief that limits exist only until someone questions them. At a farm near the desert's edge called Hangchi, researchers worked day and night, analyzing every droplet. They discovered that the key was not removing salt but reshaping it. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, minerals missing in the desert's veins, were reintroduced in precise harmony. Slowly, pond by pond, the desert learned the rhythm of the sea. When the first generation of fish survived an entire year, the impossible became real. Farmers who had spent lifetimes fighting the soil began to dig ponds of their own. If the water that once poisoned their land could now feed them, what else might it hold? Among them was a woman named Ma Chanhua. She led a small cooperative at the desert's edge, families bound by hardship and the will to endure. Guided by scientists, they stocked their ponds with crayfish and hardy aquatic plants. People laughed. A shrimp farm in the Taklamakan sounded like a fable told to children. But within one season, the ponds shimmered red with life. The crayfish fed on algae, the plants purified the water. Income tripled. Laughter turned to awe. Within months, villages across Xinjiang followed. Desert fields once cracked by drought were replaced with networks of glimmering ponds. From above, it looked as if a constellation had descended to Earth. Solar panels lined the ridges, drones traced arcs through the air, feeding data into satellites. Beneath that digital web, the desert pulsed with a heartbeat of its own. And here's where you come in. If stories like this one move you, if you believe that curiosity and courage can change our world, subscribe to Unfiltered Nation. There are more hidden revolutions like this one, and we're uncovering them one by one. By the middle of 2024, what had begun as a handful of ponds had evolved into an industry. Engineers arrived with algorithms to track salinity, temperature, and oxygen. Automatic feeders replaced buckets. Each pond became a self-contained world, balanced by light, math, and instinct. The fish were thriving not in spite of the desert, but because of it. The mineral-rich water gave them firmer flesh, richer flavor. chefs in Beijing and Shanghai began requesting Taklamakan salmon, a phrase that had once sounded like satire. The experiment spread like dawn. In the town of Aller, families who once grew cotton now harvested shrimp under the same sky that used to burn their crops away. Children rode bicycles along narrow ridges between ponds, their laughter echoing across the dunes. At night, the pools mirrored the stars, and the desert looked as if it had grown a second sky. Economists called it the Desert Sea Initiative. Environmentalists called it a paradox. How could humanity, so long at war with nature, suddenly find harmony in one of her harshest landscapes? The answer lay not in conquest but in collaboration. The scientists had not tamed the desert, they had listened to it. They worked with its chemistry, its heat, its wind, and in doing so, discovered that life is less fragile than we imagine. By late 2024, 6 cooperatives operated across Xinjiang, producing more than 180,000 tons of seafood worth over $500 million. Online sales doubled. What had been dismissed as a publicity stunt had become a blueprint for survival. As climate change tightened its grip on coasts and rivers, humanity was learning to build oceans where none had ever existed. But numbers were never the real victory. The real triumph was human. In villages where poverty once hung like dust in the air, people began to hope again. They spoke of tides, of harvests, of seasons measured not by drought but by abundance. The desert took everything from us, an elderly farmer named Luo said, and now it gives back. His words spread across social media, a single sentence that captured a global mood. Maybe the future wasn't about escaping the planet's extremes, maybe it was about embracing them. Soon, international delegations arrived from Egypt, Chile, and the United States. They came not to teach but to learn. The Taklamakan model, they realized, could transform arid lands everywhere. The same salt that once cursed the soil could be its salvation. Deserts in Africa and the Middle East began testing their own versions of inland aquaculture, using sunlight and science to turn barrenness into bounty. Back in Xinjiang, the experiment evolved again. Researchers introduced pearl oysters into the ponds, intrigued by how the desert's temperature swings might harden their shells. Most experts predicted failure. Yet by the end of 2024, more than 2 million oysters shimmered beneath the desert sun. The first pearls grown in sand instead of surf would soon reach the world's markets. They weren't merely beautiful, they were proof that imagination can be alchemy. By 2025, journalists stopped calling it an experiment. It was an ecosystem, one both technological and spiritual. Satellite images revealed turquoise threads weaving through the gold of the dunes. Locals began referring to them as the desert's veins. The ponds not only produced food, they also softened the land around them. Evaporation brought moisture to the air, and small green shoots appeared where none had grown for centuries. The Taklamakan was healing itself. What began as survival had become renewal. Farmers who once measured time by failure now measured it by growth. Children learned words their grandparents never knew: oxygen, salinity, harvest. A generation raised in scarcity was now teaching the world what abundance looked like. International organizations hailed Xinjiang's success as a model for the 21st century. The United Nations described it as one of the most promising examples of climate adaptation on Earth. Scientists called it the second green revolution, though this time the color was blue. Humanity had learned not to fight the planet's harshness, but to translate it into harmony. And still, beyond the metrics and accolades, the essence of the story remained profoundly human. It was about daring to dream when logic said no. About listening to silence until it spoke. About understanding that creation is not something reserved for gods, it's something within us. At night, as the desert cools and the stars rise, the ponds gleam like fragments of a forgotten ocean. You can hear the faint hum of machines, the gentle ripple of fish moving through moonlight, and for a moment it's easy to believe that the earth is remembering itself. If the sea of death can give birth to life, what else have we underestimated? What other frontiers hide behind our fear of the impossible? The answer might not lie in the heavens or the depths of the sea, but in places we've already written off, places like this one. So take a moment. Look at the world around you. Every barren field, every forgotten landscape, every silence that feels eternal, each carries a question: what could live here, if we only dared to try? The story of the Taklamakan is not just China's story, it's humanity's. It reminds us that imagination is the most renewable resource we possess, and that even the harshest soil will bloom again when watered with courage. If this story moved you, share it. Tell someone that the impossible has already begun to happen. And if you want to keep discovering truths that sound like miracles, subscribe to Unfiltered Nation, where reality is stranger, braver, and more beautiful than fiction. Because sometimes, the greatest seas are born not from water, but from hope.